Tupac's death was not the end of his story, because long before that night, he was quietly writing something else. Not songs, not poems, but pages that suggest he believed danger was coming. Hidden symbols, repeated warnings, writing so subtle it went unnoticed for decades, until now. Tupac passed away in 1996, but parts of his private world remained behind. Crumpled sheets, torn notebooks, and loose pages sat untouched for years. At first glance, they looked like random thoughts with no clear meaning, just scattered writing that seemed ordinary or unfinished. But years later, someone took a closer look and began noticing repeated patterns, symbols, and quiet signals hidden in plain sight. These notes suggested a side of Tupac that few people ever saw, a man who appeared cautious, observant, and deeply reflective, quietly recording thoughts he may not have felt safe expressing publicly. What was he trying to process privately, and why did he never share these thoughts openly? Today, we explore the mystery surrounding Tupac's private writings, the pages that remained unseen for decades. Years after Tupac Shakur died on that September night in 1996, most people believed they understood his life. His music, interviews, films, and documentaries were widely available, but what remained largely unknown were the personal pages he never intended for public view. These were not studio lyrics or poems prepared for release. They were loose scraps of paper written in his handwriting, stored away in boxes that went untouched for years. Some were folded tightly, others were wrinkled, stained, or torn. A few were written on the backs of receipts or hotel notepads, and to most people, they would have looked like meaningless clutter. Over time, these notes passed quietly through private hands. Family members kept some, friends held on to others, and a few were placed in storage units that were eventually forgotten. In some cases, their contents were sold during auctions when payments were missed. For years, nobody paid much attention to them because no one understood their significance. They appeared messy and incomplete, like the kind of notes any busy artist might jot down and discard. But Tupac was known for writing constantly. He wrote while traveling, between studio sessions, and late at night when he could not sleep. He filled notebooks and loose pages with thoughts faster than he could organize them. Some lines were clear, while others stopped mid-thought. Scattered throughout were repeated words, symbols, letters, and numbers that seemed to serve no clear purpose. To a casual observer, it looked disorganized, even chaotic, but that surface confusion may have been intentional. To many, these pages appeared unimportant, and for decades they were treated that way, until someone decided to look closer. A small group of longtime fans and independent researchers began collecting samples of Tupac's handwriting. They scanned pages, compared notes, and laid everything out side by side, searching for connections. At first, progress was slow. The notes were scattered and incomplete, written across different years and locations. But gradually, certain details began to repeat. Specific words appeared again and again. Similar symbols showed up on pages written months apart. Even the spacing between words seemed deliberate. What once looked random began to show signs of structure.
By chance more than planning, many of these notes survived. After Tupac's death, his belongings were divided among family, friends, and business associates. Some items were preserved carefully, while others were packed away and forgotten. A few disappeared entirely during that period. No one person had a full picture of what remained. One relative held on to a notebook from the mid-1990s. A former partner kept letters written during his time in prison. A studio engineer saved pages Tupac scribbled on during late-night sessions. Each piece existed in isolation, scattered across different states and private collections. In the early 2000s, a small group of dedicated individuals began attempting to bring these fragments together. They contacted family members, reached out to former collaborators, and monitored auctions and private sales. Progress was slow. Some people declined to share what they had. Others requested high prices. Some materials had already been lost. Still, the effort continued. Over time, they gathered hundreds of pages, full notebooks, single sheets, napkins, envelopes, and hotel pads filled with half-finished ideas. Once assembled, The collection felt overwhelming. There was no clear order. Most pages were undated. Topics shifted mid-sentence. Reading them straight through led nowhere. Yet something about the repetition, the markings, and the emphasis suggested intention. The team believed there was meaning beneath the surface. They just needed to understand how to approach it. At first glance, the notes appeared disorganized. Sentences broke off suddenly. Words were crossed out. Certain phrases appeared multiple times in clusters. Letters sat alone at the edges of pages, and numbers were scribbled in corners. To many, it looked like the restless thoughts of someone moving too quickly to organize ideas. But those studying the pages approached them with caution. Tupac was known for being deliberate in how he expressed himself publicly, even when appearing spontaneous. His music, interviews, and public image were carefully considered. That raised an important question. Why would his private writing be careless? Instead of focusing only on the words, researchers examined how they were written. They noticed that certain phrases appeared across different pages in the same format, with identical spacing and markings. Some words were consistently capitalized, while others were not. Repetitions stood out. Tupac sometimes wrote the same word repeatedly, often near specific names, dates, or symbols. When compared across notebooks, even the crossed-out sections seemed intentional. What he removed often connected to what remained, forming patterns that only became visible when viewed collectively. Rather than presenting clear statements, the notes appeared layered. The researchers believe Tupac may have written with the understanding that his work would be examined in the future, creating depth that required patience to interpret. As these patterns emerged, the team began to suspect that the pages contained a personal system of meaning.
According to those who studied the collection, the messages were not hidden using traditional codes. Instead, meaning appeared through repetition, spacing, symbols, and recurring themes. It required careful observation rather than direct translation. Symbols played a key role. Small marks appeared throughout the pages, stars, circles, crosses, in shapes that did not clearly belong to any known alphabet. At first, they seemed like casual doodles, but over time, researchers noticed they often appeared next to similar types of information. Certain symbols appeared near names, others near dates or locations. These marks were likely personal reference tools rather than secret messages meant for others. Once this possibility was considered, sections of the notes began to align more clearly, suggesting that Tupac used symbols to organize thoughts privately without writing details directly. While interpretations remain cautious and incomplete, those studying the pages believe they offer insight into how deeply Tupac reflected on his surroundings, tracking ideas, people, and moments in ways only he fully understood. The spacing was another important detail. Tupac often left unusual gaps between words, sometimes 3 or 4 spaces where only one would normally appear. At first, it looked like careless handwriting, but when the team measured those gaps, patterns began to emerge. A 3-space gap consistently appeared before names or references to people he seemed unsure about, while single spaces were used for neutral writing. In some cases, words were pushed tightly together, which appeared to signal urgency or concern. Then there were the repetitions, which turned out to be the most complex part of the system. When Tupac wrote the same words several times in a row, the number mattered. 3 repetitions suggested caution, 5 indicated something he believed was confirmed, and 7 or more marked information he considered critical. The team tested this pattern across hundreds of pages, and it remained consistent, revealing a structured layer beneath what once looked like random text. Once this system was understood, the tone of the notebooks shifted entirely. These were not just scattered thoughts, they read more like warnings. Every page carried added weight. Symbols pointed towards specific meanings, and repetitions emphasized concerns Tupac seemed to recognize well before others did. What looked like chaos may have been intentional, a way to record sensitive thoughts without making them obvious. With this framework in place, a clearer narrative began to take shape. The decoded notes suggested fears, suspicions, and an awareness of risk that the public never fully saw.
After the patterns were recognized, the content became difficult to dismiss. These entries did not read like vague worries or emotional reactions written in passing. They reflected specific observations about pressure, strained relationships, and possible threats, noted carefully over time.
Lines such as "watch the ones closest" appeared repeatedly across different notebooks. Sometimes they were written with 3 space gaps before certain initials, other times with symbols connected to dates. The team found passages where Tupac described feeling monitored, followed, or pressured from different directions. He wrote about meetings that felt uncomfortable, phone calls at odd hours, and conversations where people asked unusually detailed questions about his plans. These entries were not written as outbursts. They were recorded in a measured, almost methodical way, as if he were keeping track. Timing also stood out. Many of these notes appeared during the final 2 years of his life and clustered around moments that later gained significance. One notebook from early 1996 contained repeated references to change, often marked with 5 repetitions, suggesting confirmation. Pages from that summer mentioned pressure from multiple sides, using symbols tied to names, locations, and organizations the team could later recognize. Some entries were more direct, though still coded. Tupac wrote about people who appeared supportive in public but acted differently behind the scenes. He noted business deals that felt restrictive and situations where every option seemed risky. He avoided naming individuals outright, but the initials, spacing, and symbols suggested he was being deliberate. Some of these initials pointed toward people who had been publicly close to him. Individuals seen in photos were quoted speaking positively about him after his death. Yet in his private notes, certain initials were paired with 7 or more repetitions, which the team interpreted as signals of serious concern. These interpretations do not confirm wrongdoing, but they do show how Tupac may have viewed his circumstances at the time. Overall, the decoded pages portrayed someone who felt surrounded by potential risks, not necessarily out of paranoia, but because he believed those risks were real. He appeared to be quietly documenting his environment, creating a record that only revealed itself through careful analysis. Initials, symbols, and repeated words formed a personal system meant to hide meaning in plain sight. The initials became easier to spot once the team knew what to look for. They appeared in margins, between unrelated lines, or alone at the bottom of pages. Sometimes they were circled or underlined. Other times, the same initials appeared multiple times with different symbols. The team cataloged each set, comparing them to people connected to Tupac's life, including friends, business partners, rivals, and industry figures. What they found raised questions. Some initials first appeared with stars, which the team associated with trust or importance. Later, those same initials showed up with crossed circles, a symbol they linked to caution or concern. This suggested Tupac may have been tracking how relationships evolved, noting when trust began to change. Locations were coded differently, often as single letters paired with numbers that appeared to represent dates or addresses. A page from late 1995 included LV written 7 times, surrounded by warning symbols. The team interpreted this as a reference to Las Vegas, months before events there became historically significant. Other cities appeared in similar patterns, including studios, hotels, and places where key meetings occurred. Tupac also documented events that seemed minor at the time, but gained importance later. He recorded label meetings in detail, noting who spoke, who stayed quiet, and when discussions felt uncomfortable. Contracts, album plans, and business decisions were all tracked, especially when pressure was applied. Repeated words like contract, loyalty, and exit appeared throughout the notebooks. Their repetition counts appeared intentional. When contract appeared 5 times, it suggested confirmation. When paired with warning symbols or crossed lines, it appeared to signal risk. Seen together, these entries formed a timeline rather than isolated thoughts.
Tupac never spoke many of these concerns publicly, not necessarily because he was unwilling, but because speaking too openly may have carried consequences. While his public image was outspoken and confrontational, his private notes suggested careful planning. There were pages where he wrote accusations in full, then crossed them out entirely. In other moments, he named people before deciding to leave the information hidden. Some entries showed frustration. He wrote about wanting to expose everything and being exhausted by secrecy. His handwriting became heavier in places, words larger, punctuation repeated as if searching for answers. But often, the next page would return to themes of patience and timing. He wrote about waiting, protecting himself, and gathering proof before taking action. The notes suggest someone aware that speaking too early could backfire, that claims without evidence could be dismissed, and that influential figures could respond forcefully. He appeared to be documenting everything with the belief that the record itself mattered, almost as if these pages were meant to survive even if he could not. There were entries referencing future dates, moments when he planned to act or reveal information. Some of those dates passed without anything happening, simply because he was no longer alive. Reading plans that were never carried out adds a somber layer to the notebooks. Now, decades later, those pages are being examined in a new light. When parts of the decoded notes began circulating online, reactions were immediate. Screenshots spread quickly, forums filled with discussion. Fans who had debated Tupac's legacy for years suddenly had new material to analyze. Many responded with skepticism. The notes felt detailed, specific, and unusually aware. Questions surfaced about authenticity and interpretation. Whether viewed as insight, personal reflection, or subjective perception, the notebooks reopened conversations that had never fully ended.
What remains clear is that these writings continue to provoke discussion, not because they provide final answers, but because they offer a deeper look into how Tupac may have understood his world at the time. But as more pages came to light and handwriting specialists stated that the writing appeared consistent with Tupac's known samples, much of the early doubt began to fade. In its place came something far heavier and more difficult to process. Fans who had accepted the official account of Tupac's death, those who had learned to live with the loss and move forward, suddenly found themselves questioning long-held beliefs. If these notes were genuine, and if Tupac had sensed danger ahead and documented it so deliberately, it raised uncomfortable questions about the people around him, the industry he was navigating, and the circumstances surrounding his final years. For many, this curiosity quickly turned into deep focus. Entire online communities formed around examining the remaining pages, comparing symbols, tracking initials, and building detailed charts connecting names, dates, and events. Some fans spent hours studying single pages, zooming into images to catch small details, debating spacing, repetition, and possible meanings, often disagreeing over which interpretations were most reasonable. The atmosphere became tense and divided, largely because not everyone was ready to accept what the notes seemed to suggest. Some fans argued the writings were being misunderstood, saying Tupac may have simply been expressing private thoughts and stress, never intending for them to be seen or analyzed publicly. Others felt dismissing the notes altogether was unfair, believing that if he took the time to write them, they mattered and deserved to be taken seriously. This divide reflected a larger struggle, reconciling the private individual revealed in these notes with the public figure fans thought they knew. The Tupac shown here appeared more cautious, more strategic, and more aware of potential danger than the fearless rebel image many had embraced. It challenged the mythology built around him, revealing someone who was not only bold, but also careful, not just confrontational, but also calculating. Not only speaking truth to power, but also trying to protect himself from it. Suddenly, his final years began to feel different. Past interviews took on new meaning, lyrics sounded more layered, and every line in the notebook seemed to carry new weight. When researchers began carefully comparing the notebooks with public timelines, including concert dates, studio sessions, interviews, and media appearances,
patterns began to emerge. What developed was a timeline that closely aligned with known events while adding context that many had never considered before. Entries from 1995 describe shifts in business relationships, noting unanswered calls, unexplained meeting delays, and contract changes that he appeared uncomfortable with. These observations closely match the period when tensions with record labels were reportedly growing behind the scenes, even as he maintained confidence in public.
What once looked like sudden disputes now appeared, at least in the notes, as situations he had been monitoring for months. The summer of 1996 stood out in particular. Notes from that time were dense with symbols, initials, and repeated warnings suggesting that something significant was approaching. He referenced travel plans, security concerns, and specific individuals he believed he should avoid. The language suggests he felt pressure from multiple directions at once and was attempting to track those risks over time. He also wrote about being encouraged to attend events he felt uneasy about, being guided toward certain decisions, and feeling as though his choices were increasingly influenced by people who claimed to be acting in his best interest. What many find unsettling is how precise some of these entries were. One late August note mentioned difficult weeks ahead, marked with repeated symbols to signal importance. The spacing and emphasis suggested a situation he may have tried to prevent, but ultimately felt unable to stop. Another entry from early September listed several cities, each marked differently. Las Vegas was circled multiple times and crossed through using a symbol he often used to highlight serious concern. While this does not confirm intent or outcome, it has led many to reflect on how closely these notes align with real-world events that followed. When viewed alongside his interviews from that period, some of his public statements appear more layered. Comments about loyalty, trust, and awareness now seem less like general reflections and more like subtle references to situations he may have been experiencing privately. Not direct accusations, but cautious observations, wisdom shaped by pressure. The notes suggest someone who was not reckless or unaware, but rather someone making deliberate choices while understanding the risks involved.
They offer a glimpse into a mindset preparing for uncertainty while the outside world remained unaware. Still, it's important to be clear, these notes do not provide clear answers. They do not identify who was responsible for what, nor do they solve the mysteries that have surrounded his death for decades. They do not offer the closure many fans have hoped for since that night in September 1996 when everything changed. What they do offer is something more complex, a look into the thoughts of someone who believed he was under pressure, who felt surrounded by shifting loyalties, and who chose to document his concerns privately rather than make public claims he could not fully prove. They help explain why Tupac's public image was only part of the story. On one side, the outspoken artist the world saw. On the other, a careful observer quietly tracking patterns and risks. The notes suggest layers, information meant to be understood only by those willing to look closely. Not definitive proof, but context. They show why simple explanations no longer feel sufficient. Fans who once debated straightforward theories now face a much more complicated picture. A network of relationships, pressures, and conflicts unfolding behind the scenes while the public focused on music, headlines, and controversy. The questions raised by these notebooks continue to challenge comfortable narratives. And now that so much attention has been brought to them, many are asking what else might still be hidden. Researchers believe these notes may not be the only place where Tupac left clues about his mindset. They suggest there could be patterns embedded in his music, interviews, videos, and other writings, material that has been studied for years, but never quite this way. If he was this intentional with his private notes, it raises the question of how much thought went into the work he knew millions would analyze long after he was gone. The search is ongoing, and each new observation leads to even more questions. Whether intentional or not, the mystery continues to deepen, unfolding slowly and only revealing itself when people are willing to look beyond the surface.